Last, I want to address the question about slavery in the Constitution. Your textbook talks about this, but I also want to address it. One of the key complaints about the Constitution was that it allowed slavery to continue. And so the question is, if these were men who believed in the concept, the basic principle of all men are created equal, why did they leave slavery in the Constitution? And in fact, there's a number of provisions that actually kind of protect slavery as an institution in the Constitution. So why was that? First of all, it's important for us to remember that slavery was a tremendously important discussion at the Constitutional Convention. When we look at the two sets of notes that came out of the convention, and I've read one set in its entirety, they spent a lot of time talking about slavery. And they were particularly concerned because of the underlying social compact that they understood in the Declaration. And they said that some of the people at the convention, some of the men at the convention said, it is really hypocritical for us to claim that all men are created equal and not do away with slavery when we have the opportunity with this new Constitution. So you had basically two factions that were oriented around slavery. The Southern faction, from the Southern delegates from the Southern states, they said, if you touch slavery, we will not agree to this. We're going to walk out. Many of the Northern delegates said, we are abolitionists. We think slavery is wrong. We want to do away with it. So the question was, who is going to blink? And in this case, the broader goal of saving the Union, of creating a union out of the Articles of Confederation in which things were disintegrating, that took precedence over the short-term goal of eliminating slavery. Because the anti-slavery and the abolition movement had actually been going on for about 20 years. And even in Great Britain, beginning in the 1770s, you had a number of people who were advocating in the British Parliament for doing away with the slave trade. So this was a broader movement in Britain and America at the time, but in order to get this Constitution passed, they could not do away with slavery. So they ended up meeting the South a little bit more than halfway in terms of acceding to the South's demands. Because they wanted the Constitution, that was their primary goal. Doing away with slavery was turned into a secondary goal. So what the South wanted was when they were thinking about slavery in terms of representation in the House of Representatives, they wanted to count all of their slaves for representation in the House. So if you think about the state of Georgia, for example, and they might have 100,000 people who are free living in Georgia, but they might have 25,000 or 50,000 slaves. If you count all the slaves, then that puts Georgia's population at maybe 125 to 150,000, which gives them more seats in the House than they would otherwise have. So the South wanted each slave to be counted as a full person. What they ended up getting was the slaves counted as 3/5 of a person for the House. So that you would count the number of slaves, but then you would basically say each slave counts as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of representation. So that if you have, I'm going to make an easy number just to kind of make the math easy. Let's say you have 50,000 slaves in your state. Instead of having those 50,000 people added to your state's population to boost the number of votes you get in the House of Representatives, instead you get 30,000. So you count 30,000 of those rather than 50,000, and that 30,000 is then added to increase your representation. So the Southern states were okay with that because it increased their voting power more than not having any representation. But the Northern states were okay because it wasn't making the Southern states overtly much more powerful in Congress than they otherwise would have been. Because if you think about each state being a voting bloc, then that has to do with who has power in Congress. The second piece of this is that when the South wanted their slaves counted as free persons, the way that taxes worked back in this time period was that taxes were allocated to the states by the national government. So the national government allocates states, say, you owe this much in taxes, Georgia, Connecticut, Virginia, you owe this much in taxes. And the amount that you paid in taxes was based upon your population. So the larger your state, like Virginia, the more your state owed in taxes to the federal government. And then how each state collected those, that was a separate question. The states didn't want the southern states didn't want their slaves counted for when it came to taxation. So Georgia, for example, did want the slaves counted for representation, but they didn't want to have to pay taxes based upon their slave population. So a part of the compromise was that yes, the slaves counted toward states' representation, southern states' representation, but they also counted toward southern states' taxation. So the southern states had their taxes to the national government increased at the same time that they had some representation increased, which was much more than they wanted there. Clearly a compromise position. Now, this particular compromise is known as the 3/5 compromise, and it's notorious for in the Constitutional Convention in terms of the willingness of the authors of the Constitution to negotiate on the backs of the slaves. Right? So modernists and people actually not even in the modern era, in the pre-modern era, in the 1800s, they were harshly critical of this document for making this kind of a compromise. The argument today is the framers saw slaves as less than human. How much less of a human being? They only saw them as equal to 3/5 of an actual person. But I think that's kind of overstating what was going on here. That this had to do with the voting power of the South in Congress and the taxation that the South was going to be responsible for in the federal government. So that they made this compromise was clearly troublesome, but it was not as neat and clean as saying, well, these aren't really human beings, they're only 3/5 of a human being, so that's the only way we're going to consider them. That's not what the thinking was by the negotiators at this time. At least from the abolitionists, the free state negotiators, that's not the way they were thinking. So again, it's one of these complicated questions that is a challenge to reconcile with our concepts today. The South also wanted unrestricted importation of slaves. They said, if we're going to approve this Constitution, what we want is we want to be able to import slaves for as long as we want to be able to import them. What they got instead was that the importation of slaves was allowed only until 1808. So they got another 21 years. This is 1787. They got another 21 years of importing slaves, and then the slave trade would be stopped, which was about the same time that the Great Britain also ended its slave trade, was right around that same time period. So then again, the criticism is the Constitution appears to endorse the slave trade by saying we're going to permit this, and we're going to permit it for another 21 years. But the flip side of that interpretation is, in the context, it was a limitation on the slave trade that when we look at the writings of the founders, the ones who wanted to do away with slavery thought that this would stop slavery. They thought that within a couple of generations that this would mean you wouldn't have any more slaves. But what this actually produced was an unintended outcome. And the unintended outcome of this was the need of the Southern economy for more cheap labor. They could not import, after 1808, they could not import more slaves. So they increased the size of their slave holding the natural way. And so what this actually led to, this was, given this demand, this was a compromise, right? But given this compromise, what this led to was actually the breeding of slaves for the purpose of increasing slaves. And so this led to kind of even a more dehumanization of slaves under slavery in the southern states in particular than was going on prior to this. Prior to this, they could just import more slaves. They didn't have to really focus on making more slaves. But after this happened, then they started to increase the intentional growth of the population through biological means. The last thing the southern states wanted in these negotiations was they wanted assurance that if slaves ran away from the slave states, that they would be returned. And in fact, that's what they got. They got that one completely. So the interpretation of what to make of this, what to make of the ideas of the founders in terms of doing this, if you look only at what the Constitution says about slavery, and by the way, the language in the Constitution never actually uses the word slave or slavery. In every reference to these provisions of the Constitution, they're the people that we know we're talking about slaves, they're referred to as persons. Right? So when you look at the Constitution's statements about these persons, it looks pretty bad. Slaves are only counted, these persons are only counted as 3/5 of a human being. You can continue to import these for another generation, and you return them recognizing their status as property rather than as human beings. But if you look at these provisions of the Constitution in the context of the demands of the South, it doesn't look quite as onerous, quite as terrible as if the South had gotten everything that it wanted. And this process is typical in politics. When two sides take a position in politics, it's almost never the case that when they have some parity in their negotiating, that nobody gets everything they want. It almost never happens that anybody gets exactly what they wanted at the beginning of the negotiations.
Eventually, he changed his mind looking at the actual text of the Constitution rather than looking at trying to discern the intentions of the founders from the time, from the writings of other things that were going on at the time. He essentially gave a speech in which he argued that in the Constitution's provisions, the freed slaves would be counted more for representation than held slaves. This is part of the Three-Fifths Compromise, and his argument was that this would give incentive for the states to pressure slave owners to free their slaves so that they would be able to get more representation. He also argued that ending the slave trade, even though it was allowed for 21 years, was an acknowledgement that slavery was on its way out, and it was a means to ending slavery itself. He argued that the Fugitive Slave Clause, because it didn't actually mention slavery or slaves, that it referred broadly to all kinds of people who were in all kinds of economic situations trying to flee states in which they were criminals or in which they held debts. And he used the example of indentured Irish servants who signed away for their freedom of mobility for a few years in exchange usually for coming to the United States from another country, from Ireland or from England, who then would try to ditch their commitment. And then finally, his overall theme seems to be that the authors of the Constitution steadfastly avoided using the word slave or slavery. Instead, every time that there's a passage in the original Constitution that refers to what everybody knows are slaves, they actually use the word persons, reinforcing the humanity and the perception of the authors that slaves were actually human beings and that then had some political rights that could come to them.
Of the people on the other side. Remember that the primary goal is to get the Constitution passed. The Southern states wouldn't abolish slavery. So the framers then had to come up with some kind of a strategy, positions on these questions, that would keep the South in the country at the same time that they would get the Constitution passed. And so these provisions were designed to create that compromise. The framers who were opposed to slavery, when we read what they wrote at the time, they believed they were setting the stage for the end of slavery. Remember, we talked about Jefferson's view. He was really ambivalent about it. And even though Jefferson wasn't at the convention, his views reflected the views of the abolitionists of the day. Basically, what this compromise allowed is for them to delay dealing with slavery. And so we know now it took another 80 years for the slaves to be free, for slavery to become illegal in the country. But the delegates believed they were setting the stage for that to happen much more quickly, especially the closing the importation of slaves. They thought that would really cut off the pipeline for the creation of new slaves. And what the Southern delegates did was they were willing to concede some of the pro-business pieces of the Constitution that were advocated by the Northerners. So the Northerners weren't just kind of being completely altruistic in this. They had interests as well. And so they had some things that they wanted in terms of what the Constitution would say about dealing with debts that were held prior to the Revolutionary War. They had questions about that in terms of commercial interests, that were what Congress's powers would be with regard to commercial interests. And so the Southern delegates didn't really care about that stuff because they're an agricultural economy. But the Northern states were much more becoming a manufacturing and commercial economy. And so the Northern states had their interests that they wanted, and the Southern states said, all right, well, if you want us to sign on to that, we want some of our concessions on the slavery issue. So there was this process called log rolling that we still use this phrase today, this word today. Log rolling is the idea that you trade votes in order to get what you want. You get some people who agree to vote one way in order to get what they want on another issue. And that's what was going on between the Northern and Southern delegates in the Constitutional Convention. Questions? Okay.